Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I have two guests today, Alexander Haque, the CEO of Retinad VR, and Maryam Saboor. She's a strategic consultant that's working with Alexander. Looks like they've just been acquired by a company called Lumiere. So we're going to get into what Retinad does. We're going to talk a little bit about Lumiere and all their current efforts. So thanks for coming on the podcast, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard, for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, let's start simple. So what's the premise of Retinad VR?
Right. So Retinad was actually a pretty simple premise. It was born out of a requirement to measure and understand behavior and performance in VR. And what I mean by that is taking a step back, the VR market as it is today, or the VR industry as it is today, was born about 4 years ago, just after the acquisition of Oculus by Facebook, is really a turning point and milestone for the VR industry. And with that, there was a huge uptick of indie developers building amazing gaming and non-gaming VR experiences for the market and for the Oculus Rift, which was the company that Facebook acquired. And what we were seeing is that while developers were building these pretty cool, novel experiences, a lot of them were pretty janky, had a lot of issues. And nobody really had a way to measure the user, interaction, sentiment, and ultimately the behavior. So Retinad was born out of this major problem in the industry of measuring and understanding that behavior. And yeah, we do that through a lot of ways, and I'm happy to dive into. But also happy for Maryam to take the floor and intro how she got involved as well. I think it'd be cool for her to talk.
Maryam, if you would, go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess thinking back to how it kind of all started, at the time, the CEO of Retinad was actually someone different. It was Samuel Poirier, and they were just kind of preparing to do an initial pitch for one of their investors, and that's kind of how I got involved in helping them kind of create that pitch and refine it. And it actually led to a really interesting offer. They had like $1 million offer, 24 hours to respond to, and they actually decided to reject it. So, back then in, I think that was 2015, it was a really wild time for the VR market. And what ended up happening was they actually, Alex, I guess you can kind of speak to this, but Alex kind of came in shortly after, and they did end up raising a great round. And ever since, I've kind of been helping them just with clients, with business models. I helped with the more recent acquisition as well. And ever since Alex kind of joined, I guess they kind of pivoted from what they were in the beginning.
Yeah,
$1 million offer with 24 hours to respond. It sounds like something Mark Cuban would do on Shark Tank, Right.
Yeah,
okay.
It's crazy time of startups, right? Especially the gold rush after Facebook. It was like Bitcoin of 2016.
Okay. So, let's back to the Retinad VR. So you wanted to, you're right. I've never heard anyone talk about user behavior. I've just heard it as a one-way thing. We're company X and we provide a VR experience that does this, that, and the other. But I've never heard about, all right, the user experience and the feedback and what kind of parameters or things are you looking for? So someone has one of your, a VR experience. What are the parameters and things that you're looking for? What does feedback mean? What kind of user behavior? What things?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So, primarily what we're tracking and the one novel metric to virtual reality as opposed to any other medium, let's say like, web or mobile, analytics or behavior tracking, is the fact that with this is user that actually has a VR headset on, we're able to track where a user looks. And I don't mean quite eye tracking, although that does exist within a VR headset today. What I mean is actually a little bit more bare bones, which is just positional head tracking. So these sensors that are inside of the VR headset that track your movement for, video game design purpose or just, VR locomotion purpose actually serve as a tool to understand, how the user is gazing as well. So that type of data that we're able to collect is novel for VR. It may not be novel to the scientific community, but you can imagine this is novel in the sense of if there's, let's say, 10 million VR headsets that are distributed across the world, that's pretty phenomenal data uptake that you can have. So again, primarily where users are looking, how they move around their hands in VR, if they have like a tethered headset right now, like an Oculus Rift or an HTC Vive, some of the more powerful VR headsets, not like a Google Cardboard or a Samsung Gear VR, which need to be distinguished from those first two, which are a little bit lower fidelity VR experiences you can't really move your body around in VR. There's no locomotion. And it's reserved to where people are looking. But we can also measure those classic metrics as well, right? So that Google Analytics or a mixed panel would provide. So what kind of device are people using? What kind of Play Store are people purchasing apps in? Where, how many streams and downloads do they have coming from different videos or apps and games? And then really trying to understand the grammar and language of VR as well, which is something Maryam helped us decipher as well. Because at first we were just collecting all this kind of noise, I would say. All this novel data was really cool, but when you actually have to kind of, look at it under a microscope and make sense of it, it's kind of like this alphabet soup. And it's just extremely messy and extremely noisy. And Maryam, maybe you can speak to how you helped us as well decipher, some of the first learnings and key insights in the grammar of VR. I think would be really cool.
Sure. Are you kind of speaking to Jeremy Balance and stuff? So I can kind of talk to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, or how there was like stuff that we did with Yahoo as well. Jeremy Balance, I think, is great for you to speak about as well.
Yeah, sure, definitely. So, I mean, kind of where my background kind of helped them as well was I've done a lot of research back when in law school, kind of just about immersive tech, kind of how it affects behavior, thinking to empathy, thinking also to kind of the more negative use cases in terms of, how that can be used for, data collection and user privacy as well. There's actually a concept called a kinematic fingerprint. That's essentially in virtual reality, the way you move, so your hand movements, your head movements, eye tracking, all of these things can actually give this kinematic type of fingerprint. Working with Retinad, obviously one of the things they really always wanted to focus on was making sure that, they were kind of being very careful on how this data was being used, because obviously there's no real, regulations around it right now. There's tons of gray areas, kind of how all this biometric data is being used as well. Even if you look at the Oculus headset, big company, they are still collecting all of this data and they warn you, but they don't choose not to. And it's not that transparent exactly how it's being used. So keeping all of kind of the dark side in mind is really important to kind of really understand how behavior is affected in VR. So the reason why we kind of just mentioned Jeremy Balance in between the two of us is because he is a professor at Stanford University out at the Virtual Human Interaction Lab. And he runs all of these studies about how VR affects behavior. It's great because a lot of the studies actually focus on the good ways that it affects behavior. So to give you like a really, silly example, if I was to see myself in virtual reality as a female avatar, and let's say my avatar were to be slapped, my skin heat conductance and my heart rate would go up and react the same way as if I were slapped in real life. So this already is novel to see kind of how, the behavior translates into real life. But what's even more novel is that if I were to see that same avatar and it was to be a male avatar, someone different from me, I would still have that same effect if they were to be slapped in VR. So it's really interesting because it has all of these novel kind of use cases for kind of embodying different perspectives. So if you think about, the way that translates across different ages, different races, different species, if you're an animal in VR, a plant in VR, it's really interesting. So kind of going back to what that looks like in terms of metrics, I think Alex actually, he kind of really helped lead with their data scientists, really kind of novel metrics in terms of how we're able to measure all of these different things. And maybe, Alex, you want to speak to the activity score in specific and kind of how you came up with that and what that translates to. I think that's something that's really different that Retinad does compared to other analytics companies.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, quick question before you get into that.
Yeah, sure.
You know, I'd always like to know. So, yeah, one thing someone told me about VR, which I didn't realize it was obvious, is that everything can be recorded about experience. Everything that's seen, every movement, everything. So you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Privacy could be a big issue.
Definitely.
You know, so you talk to people that study behavior, and you're collecting metrics yourself. So what's the interesting stuff you found that surprised you? You know, that you can talk about before we delve into, like, you know, the activity score. What did you see, and you were like, huh, interesting? Yeah,
absolutely. So we actually worked with Jessica Brilhart, who was the head creative at Google VR, the Jump VR team, which is one of the pioneers for 360 VR video back in 2016 and still is today. And what we found, so what we were commissioned to do is just understand, you know, how are people actually reacting to this narrative piece. So she filmed a couple pieces that she sent our way, and one of the most memorable ones that she had posted online, actually as a blog, was a video of the Montreal Canadiens playing ice hockey and a tour of the stadium. So there was about a 5-minute piece of this beautiful 360 VR video, and there was this one moment in particular that Jessica and the VR team were really, really interested in and understanding if people were actually reacting to. Her whole hypothesis and theory was that after the Canadiens had scored a goal, the crowd is reacting and jumping and cheering, and you can see all around you in 360 and see the fan reactions as if you're right there in the stadium with them. There's this old gentleman who kind of looks over to the 360 camera, which is your perspective in VR, and kind of nods at you. So I guess he was nodding at Jessica or whoever was making the film at that time at the camera as kind of an acknowledgement, and, you know, kind of giving like a fist pump, like a cheers. And her hypothesis was that this act of breaking the fourth wall that you can experience in a film was much deeper and much of a deeper sensation, much deeper felt in VR. And we actually took that, gave this video to, you know, a few dozen people and collect, I think it was about 35 to 40 data points at that time when we had done this study. And we looked for, okay, well, where are people actually looking, as I said, is one of the biggest metrics that we're checking. And we looked at specifically that gentleman. So we had a tool that was able to kind of segment a part of a video and filter out one specific frame or image, or a couple of specific keyframes and images. And we looked for how often is that, let's say, that target or that image actually hit. And her hypothesis was actually absolutely correct. That act of that one person looking at you and engaging with you, despite the fact that you could look at all these other fans, seemed to draw in everyone's attention and really get everybody kind of, you know, very excited throughout that experience, or just kind of feel closer to the game. And the way we were measuring that is, one, of course, you know, were they actually engaging with this gentleman, and kind of engagement was who looks at this gentleman for 3 seconds or more, I believe the metric was. And it was about an 85% success rate, or, you know, engagement rate that we had achieved. So that kind of, and, you know, those kind of early metrics of, one, you know, where are people looking, but more specifically, are they as a director, are they actually looking at the stuff that I intend them to look? Or if I have no real intention, I'm just trying to figure out the medium, how are people actually kind of going down this narrative path? And what that gave birth to is, okay, well, if this alphabet soup that I mentioned before can kind of be deconstructed, and now, you know, we get this an actual alphabet, or some sort of sensation of an alphabet, we can actually get to language. And the language of VR through data started to be developed specifically for narrative purposes. So we started having creators jump onto the platform and say, okay, well, I want to test this thing. Do people actually look at, like, the pink elephant over here, or do they look at the plane that's on top of them? And, you know, trying to figure out what are the actual behaviors that people are having. And as a final one, and I can let Maryam talk, or I can let you ask another question, but a final thing that I thought was really cool, we had conducted another study with Yahoo, and more on the brand and creative side. And what we were trying to understand is the saliency model, or like this, again, that kind of language or grammar of VR. And we were looking, there's no real, I guess, question in terms of, these are the things that we care that people are looking at necessarily, other than, let's say, a branded logo. But it was more, how are people behaving? Like, you tell us, what are people doing when they're inside of a headset? And what differentiates a good experience from a bad one? And what we found was, in VR, despite the hypothesis, let's say, from a creator just saying, well, if I have a 360 scene in VR, it should be engaging enough and fun enough for a user to kind of move all around and really stick throughout the narrative. And what we found was that hypothesis is actually very false. What you need to do, or not entirely, or very nuanced, and what you need to do to keep somebody immersed in a VR experience is actually hit them with something that's not visual whatsoever. And that sounds kind of paradoxical to something like virtual reality, which relies extremely heavily on the perceptual sense right now. What we found is that it's actually audio. If you're able to get somebody within the first 5 seconds, hit them with an audio cue within 5 seconds, and get them to use that to guide them, to get them to move around within the first 5 seconds, the rate of completion in a VR video or a 360 experience goes up about 80%. And that's a phenomenal data point. That it's an early data point. We need to study it a little bit more, but it's a pretty cool piece of information to understand. Oh, and it sounds obvious in retrospect, but a lot of VR video, a lot of the biggest complaint, like I was saying, is that a lot of it just kind of is not sticking with users. So just having that as a creative, that little piece of information is helping get people to move around. Because a lot of VR video, unfortunately, yeah.
What kind of a sound? Is it a chime that announces you into the experience, or is it a welcome message, or what could it be? Any of those things?
It's actually it's that stuff, but again, nuanced with like positional audio. So you have to have it kind of like stereo, right? So it assumes that the user's watching this with some sort of a little bit higher end or like integrated audio headphones that are there, or some sort of headphones that they're wearing as well. And it's positional audio, and Dolby and Facebook all have their own 3D tools or 360 audio tools. And it's something that kind of comes from the back of your head and guides you to look around, and then opens up with a strong visual. So it's something that I would call as like different than what we're used to in the 2D, TV world, if that makes any sense. What I just explained. Yeah.
Well, I'm picturing you put on a VR headset, and a voice says welcome, and maybe it highlights visually things you're supposed to look at and orients you for the first few seconds.
Yeah.
The guess on what would help in experience, instead of just you put it on and then you're supposed to start looking around and figure out what's going on and what you're supposed to look at.
That's actually entirely correct. And Google came out with an experience recently in the last 6 months that does that, where they start off with like a darker screen, and then there's like a stage spotlight that pops up, highlights the main character, and then there's illuminates the scene slowly over time and gives the user agency. But you're absolutely right. Giving the user too much agency right away is just overwhelming. People don't actually know what to focus on, so they still need to be guided a little bit.
Okay. So what metrics have you found are important in VR? This orientation is important. What else do you measure that you found is important or revealing or unusual or useful?
Yeah. There's stuff that we're not measuring entirely that I think is super important. So stuff like EEGs. We were early on, we were trying to decipher emotion in VR. But Maryam, do you want to take that one? Because you were helping us definitely during the whole neuroscience phase of the company. I think it would be helpful.
That's okay. I'll defer to you on that. I think you did a good job with that.
All right. So there's a whole other gamut of data points that are super important to virtual reality as well. So you can imagine VR as the extension of the real world. I mean, what do you care about in a virtual world is probably all the same metrics that you would care a lot about in the real world. So understanding how, so something like galvanic skin response. So, how are people sweating, and are people's heart rates going up? Are they feeling an adrenaline rush? And how do you measure that? Are people smiling? Are they laughing? Are they, if they're scared, are they, jerking their head back? Like what is happening, and all the classical scientific methods of data consumption on like physiological responses are all things that you can measure hypothetically in VR. You just can't measure them at scale. And what I mean by that is there's no input method today in a VR headset, let's say for eye tracking, or there's no that is offered at scale. It exists, but at a very small scale. There's companies that are working on things like EEG, so electronic encephalograph responses, which is your brain waves, and understanding. There's a whole body of science around how can you measure how your mind is doing just based off of EEGs. And there's a whole, debate amongst the scientific community whether that data is good or bad or whatever. But it is still a parameter that we're looking into. And there's a company out of Michigan, the University of Michigan. It's now a much larger company that we had met a couple years ago that was working on a customized VR headset that had these EEG inputs called Neurable. And Ramses Al-Assad, who's the CEO over there, introduced a really, really cool headset that measures this. Did you have a question? I thought I heard something.
Well, you can measure all these things. You can measure a million things, but in order to be focused, do you have an idea of what you should be measuring and why? What are the most? Are there things you want to measure that you can't, that you think could be really useful, or are there things that? Again, there's so many things you could measure. How do you know how to focus yourself and what will be helpful?
Yeah. So, like in data science, it's a problem of something called overfitting, which is you try to measure everything, but then it just becomes, again, a big soup of data. Like everything matters, but nothing matters. So again, it's just like, oh man, we're going down like a slippery slope of which data point matters the most. And you just kind of have to, based off of the assumptions. So like EEG, so to answer your question directly, like Maryam, like I think we can agree, like what Ramses is working on, if EEGs turn out to be a reliable data source, because again, there's a lot of debate, that would be really, really crazy, because their entire premise is that you can control something in the real world through a VR headset and just using your mind. So like a brain computer interface. That is a phenomenal thing to track and understand. On the privacy side, that gets super dangerous as well, but it is a phenomenal thing to understand and track. I think something a little bit more simple, like whether you're smiling or eye tracking, whether your eyes are dilating or your pupils are dilating, and how you're reacting within a VR experience can start to give you the first inklings of emotional response at scale, which again is super exciting to measure and track. So I think those two, like EEG, maybe less so, but definitely like eye tracking. And I think companies like Facebook, scarily enough, are working on that. The HTC Vive also has an input for that. So those are some data points. I don't know, Maryam, what do you think? Are those?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because there's kind of two things here. There's what can be done now at scale. So like what Retinad can do, because obviously Retinad is a software company, not a hardware company. So they are limited to essentially what are the masses using, because they're not selling any additional hardware piece to be able to get these extra inputs of data. They've spoken to different partners about, for like eye tracking companies or EEGs and the like. But again, when, there's only a small handful of people using these extra pieces of hardware, that data is not necessarily meaningful yet. But the other concept, I think kind of, if I'm not mistaken, the way you had asked the question was kind of asking about what's more, like which one's more meaningful, or, which input essentially is the most meaningful. In that regard, right. It's interesting because it kind of also depends on purpose. Whether you're a brand or whether you are, trying to help for training purposes, like, training employees, or, sometimes VR is used even for training athletes. So it kind of depends, like, what is your purpose? If you're a brand, well, the more data, the better probably for you, because, you kind of want to know all of the ways your users are interacting with your branded objects in these virtual environments. But, what is that used today at scale? Well, that tends to be kind of where users are looking. So what maybe, Alex, you can kind of speak to is what's kind of the difference between eye tracking and kind of gaze, which is kind of what Retinad looks to, because of the fact that it's the type of hardware being used is limited, and being able to track all of these data points
Richard, what do you think?
Go ahead. Well, what I see is this, and I'm an outsider, so I don't know. I bet you can track 100 different things, and that's great. But you have to focus somewhere. And what will be the usefulness of tracking this or that or the other? Without going crazy and being ineffective, I would have to say, all right, well, we can track these 100 things, but out of all of them, only these 7 we think are going to be the most exciting or useful. So we'll start with those. That's why I wanted to ask you that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, Maryam, you hit the nail on the head. I think, eye tracking is definitely the thing that will be available, rapidly or more available very soon, just because eye tracking itself just helps with focus in VR, meaning like you're able to, I guess I'm looking for the actual word, it's escaping me right now, but like the field of view, the area available to you as a user, you can just process more or less in real time. So like your eyes can only see a very limited field of view, so it doesn't make sense to render an entire virtual world. It just makes more sense to like, what are you actually looking at inside of a VR experience? So from a technical perspective, that's super important. From like a brand or agency perspective, or like marketing perspective, that's also extremely important. And marketing dollars are also what are going to funnel this industry for quite some time, I believe, and help it get started. And the reason why that's super important is, again, advertisers are just clamoring to understand things like brand recall, brand memorability, kind of all those recall metrics. And the way that you could start to, estimate this at scale is if, like, Richard, you looked at like the Coke logo for 8 seconds, Maryam looked at it for 9, and I looked at it for 4. If you start to introduce things like programmatic advertising, you start to learn user behavior to such a precise detail over time that like advertising becomes much more targeted, much more relevant. So I can start bidding based on not like a click metric or, how long did you browse maybe metric on this web page. I can know like on literally where you looked metric, like a gaze ratio. And that, for advertisers to understand, okay, well, Richard's a more valuable customer because every single video we shoot his way, he's engaging with that logo, versus Alex, who might be looking at something different. So targeted advertising becomes extremely relevant, and depending how you look on it, very, very lucrative, very dangerous, of the same side of the coin, or different sides of the same coin. But yeah, I mean, definitely eye tracking is something you would care about.
Yeah, and I can see what you mean. It would be a lot more efficient if I only had to render the VR, a half second before you looked at it. I only had to, if you had a field of view of 30 degrees, I only have to render that part of it, not the whole 360. That made the headset run a lot better.
Exactly. Foveated. It was called foveated rendering. It was escaping me, but yeah, from the fovea of the eye, it's where you're looking around, as opposed to, like you said, everywhere. Yeah.
So what are you finding that companies are most interested in? Again, you can measure all these things. What are they coming to you and saying, we want to measure this, that, or the other? And does that surprise you?
It totally depends on the client. I mean, Maryam helped us with this because at first, we're just VR nerds, right? So we're just like, well, people are going to need this, and that's generally just a problem of geeks in any industry, is to build something for themselves, and then hopefully there's more of themselves that's a market. So Maryam really helped us go through and segment every single customer base, from video like indie game developers to big game studios that would care about like, where is a player looking around when they get stuck in one of the virtual reality scenes? Are they getting stuck here or there? Like, are they getting stuck when they're looking at the lever, or where they're looking at, I don't know, some sort of monster or something? Who knows? If you're an enterprise customer and you're using it for training purposes, you care about similar stuff, I guess, to video games, which is where people, like, let's say you've got like a train conduction simulation or some sort of construction simulation in VR, which a lot of companies are starting to jump into right now. It becomes a question of, how fast are my operators actually completing this training simulation, and where are they getting stuck? And how do I then translate that into the real world? And can I benchmark what they're doing in the real world and then bring that back into VR and basically help fine tune these people and make them into like super workers through VR. That's second component. Maryam was phenomenal in helping us with that. And then, for advertisers, we just spoke, I think, a lot to that. But for advertisers, it's how long are people engaging with my brand, with my branded assets, with my content, and where specifically are they looking in that content? Can I target them better? If you're a videographer, a cinematographer, it was all the stuff that we did. We pioneered with studios like Felix and Paul and Jessica Brilhart. How are people navigating through a VR scene? What key elements are they looking at? Key narrative elements and audio elements are they looking at? And how are they moving around?
And when are people dropping out as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's not only what they're doing, but like what are they doing just before they stop or they fail at completing an experience. I don't know, Maryam, am I missing anything?
No, I think that's pretty good actually. Those just kind of like, I think those 4 kind of bigger use cases that tend to be the main ones.
All right. Well, very good. Let's talk briefly about Lumiere. You said that they had acquired Retinad VR. So what is Lumiere about? And now you're part of a bigger company or a different company. So how's that going to interface with what you're doing?
Yeah, totally. Maryam, I think this is one for you because you really helped us identify Lumiere as a first customer and then potential acquisition target as well.
Yeah, definitely. So like Alex actually just mentioned, so Lumiere was a customer first for Retinad. They were looking for analytics internally. At the time they were focused mostly on content creation, but more recently what they're doing is they're actually working on distribution as well. So they not only create content, but they set up VR theaters, working with aquariums and museums. And now more recently they have a larger client. I'm not sure if we can speak to it. Alex, are we allowed to speak to that one?
Yeah, I will leave it off the table for right now until we make it.
Okay, sure. But in the week or two, they'll be able to announce kind of a larger venue that they're working with as well, where essentially they're setting up these virtual reality theaters, and basically what they've built is a syncing software. So one problem right now is if you're trying to show content to let's say 2 people or 10 people or 50 people. One kind of pain point is being able to synchronize that and have everyone go through the experience at the same time, especially if you're using kind of the Oculus Go headsets, which tend to be very popular because they don't need they don't need a mobile phone. They're wireless and they're at a great price point, around $250 to $300. The problem is also, if you're not using speakers, everyone can hear what's happening at the same time. So tons of pain points around that. And what they've built is a really great synchronization software where essentially, a third person operator who has no technical background, doesn't have to know how to work any of the headsets, really can just use a tablet and then just, start the experiences, pause the experiences, and kind of manage the entire theater through the tablet without needing to even, worry about the controller or how to work the headsets. So essentially this distribution kind of location-based entertainment that they're providing is really a hot industry, especially for 360 content, as a lot of creators are having problems monetizing. They kind of provide this kind of end-to-end solution where they're able to help all of these creators creating content, get their content in the hands of, again, museums, aquariums, and users who will actually pay to watch that content. So now they've acquired Retinad to not only, so Retinad before was more external facing, but really now it's kind of more of an internal tool, because what it will do is it will help them and their clients as well kind of understand how people are engaging with the content going through the theaters. And so Alex kind of mentioned at the very end how one of the use cases was cinematic companies or, creators doing kind of VR and film. So they're going to be using that tool internally to kind of understand their own content in terms of how people interact with different kinds of content. So if you think of kind of like, the Netflix of VR, the same way Netflix kind of does their own content and tests it out and, tries to see how people interact with it. Analytics is very novel there because it'll allow you to do the same thing for virtual reality content, to be able to build better content and find out what is it that users really want, since it's so nascent that people don't really know yet what makes a really fantastic VR film. And then also using it for the distribution part.
Yeah, it sounds like I would be overwhelmed if I were you guys, because there's so many possibilities that hopefully you're not, but I mean, it literally is. It's the Wild West, it seems like, which is great. It's exciting. Yeah,
it's been described like that very, very often. So you're right on the mark. Absolutely.
There was a movie came out a few months ago, Ready Player One, and I know that movies are not real, but it painted a very exciting picture of what may some elements of VR, what may be possible in the future. What's as insiders, what's your guys' comments on it? What did you like about it? What did you think was ridiculous?
Oh, I love that
What
question.
did you think was inspiring?
Yeah.
That's funny. Actually, so I read that book before watching the movie, and I loved the book. I feel like the movie didn't do the book justice, but I did actually really enjoy the movie. So I think a lot of people were kind of cynical to say, and saying like, I don't know, the movie maybe was too fantasy-like, but I actually think that it did paint a picture in terms of, what can be done in virtual reality. And it's funny because a lot of the things actually can already be done. Again, not at scale, but there are tons of companies already that can do, like walking in VR. So like moving in VR using like a kind of like a treadmill type of a piece of equipment. There's already haptic gloves out there, haptic suits. There's all sorts of like on a small scale companies that are able to do a lot of the things that they were showing. Even these like virtual worlds already exist, with companies like Sansar, VR Chat, all of these social VR spaces where you can essentially be kind of like an avatar, a virtual avatar, and create your own rooms. So a lot of that, it's funny because in my mind it's already there and it exists. It's just not scaled to the masses yet. So it didn't seem that far-fetched to me, which going to your other point, it's kind of scary that it's not that far-fetched, because I guess the movie kind of had a moral to say that it's not good to really be, only in that virtual world and to allow that virtual world to be possessed by any one company. So I think if there's a key takeaway there, it's kind of the perils of what VR could be like in the future. And so what that speaks to is needing it to be as open source as possible. So it is really scary that a lot of again, it's normal because right now a lot of what's happening is going to be, it's going to be private, it's going to be large corps or small startups. So, but it is important from early on for, I think, kind of third-party kind of agencies or bodies to be set up with that kind of either regulate or help create open source guidelines around who kind of owns content, who owns these virtual worlds, and all of the data coming along with it.
Yeah, what's interesting about the movie is there were people in the movie that their whole lives were in VR. That's it.
Yeah,
I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem that. For some reason, VR doesn't appeal to me. Like maybe I'm different. I don't know. I like it. It's cool, but it's not something I'd want to do constantly. And I don't know if that's because the technology is not advanced enough, or it's just human nature is like that. What have you guys seen? Have you seen that the possibility for addiction and complete immersion is very high, or is it less than you expected?
I mean, you're speaking to early adopters who like spend several hours a day in VR. So I mean, the addiction in VR is definitely a real possibility. I think addiction also in this case, like over usage of anything, of course, is bad. But so I guess two things. The first is, yes, the technology is not necessarily there, and that's why the industry itself has not moved the needle forward that too much in the last couple of years in terms of mass adoption. Zuckerberg came out 6 months ago saying, hey, our goal at Facebook and Oculus is to have 1 billion people in VR in the next 5 years or something crazy like that, or 10 years. I forget what it was. It was a pretty ambitious goal, all things considered. And then he jokingly and awkwardly, walked onto stage and said, hey, this last Oculus Connect, which was just last week, which is an annual industry Oculus conference. He said, how are we doing? And then he had this graph of 1 billion and then, a percentage marker, and then it just hit 1%. So he was kind of laughing at himself and saying, oh, yeah, it's pretty ambitious. And what Facebook is committed to doing is create like a lot of the problems with VR is, one, content's not necessarily very good. Like, we haven't figured out that grammar. And two, the screen, what we call the screen door effect, or, not looking like a very crystal clear image when you put on VR, it being nauseating has been a big problem. They're tackling that as well. Three, price point. To get a real VR experience is super expensive. It's not accessible to people. Wires, it's all tethered. It's just like, it's heavy, bulky gear. It's weird. It's just not easy for a consumer to pop into. Like a smartphone is just everything in the palm of your hand, and then all of a sudden we're asking the user to go through all these hoops and ladders to get through, to just take 3 minutes to watch, mediocre content. It's just, that's why the industry hasn't taken off. And part of it is exactly that, Richard, the headsets just haven't been there. So now, just recently announced is the Oculus Quest, which is all the promise of VR as it was supposed to be a few years ago, but without all the headaches of like a dedicated smartphone, wires, $2,000. You don't need all that stuff. It's, I think it's $300 or $400 headset now that was going to come into market in spring 2019 of next year. And that will help hopefully curb a lot of the main issues with VR today and make it extremely accessible and very fun for users. So to give you an idea, I was playing like tennis. Like it sounds like Wii U or the Wii tennis that we were playing in 2008, but now you're embodied in your living room and you can play with, for your friends halfway across the world. And it might not sound incredible or fun, but it's really amazing to connect with people in that way and play games or just say hi. And, the awkwardness of FaceTime of like, I'm holding my phone and kind of looking at you, and am I supposed to have a conversation, or like, what is this body language? It feels awkward. All of that just kind of comes together, and all the pain of that is taken away when it just feels like you and I can be in the same room sharing an experience at the same time. So all of those weird, like physical and financial issues that were, hindering VR, I think will be gone. And I'm forgetting what the other part of my discussion point was, but I think I captured most of it. But so short answer is yes. I think it will get better. I'm confident. And VR.
Yeah, and hopefully it won't be a world where everyone's just in VR constantly and not in the real world. I remember, 30 years ago with video games, they would call people that played them all the time as vidiots, like an idiot, And there were stories of people like, their whole life was in video games, and it was, I wonder if the same parallel will happen or not.
Well, look at it this way. Like we're all walking around like zombies right now outside with our text neck, like a physiological result of us, looking down. I think I have it, just us looking downwards all the time on our phone and not actually experiencing the world as is. And now, I'm not saying VR is going to fix this or solve this or is the next great thing to, make this better. And tech definitely has its limits, and I think reality is always going to beat VR. But there's a game out there called Beat Saber that is having such a phenomenal impact on people, getting them to move around, and people are losing 30, 40, 50, 100 pounds playing this game, and people are we're not connected despite social media. I mean, this is a whole different discussion, so I won't get into it, but it's really difficult to connect with people and to have this ability to actually connect, even if it's with an avatar, and express yourself in a way that you may not feel comfortable expressing in the real world. And to have this outlet, I think is so important that, sure, there's always, with any technology or anything you do, there's always this fear of vidiots or VR idiots that we might call them, or just, people are lounging around in VR, and for sure that will happen. But I think that the good and the positives that will result from VR is going to benefit humanity way more than the fears that come along with it.
That makes sense. Yeah.
To give you my rosy thoughts.
Well, it's better than the thoughts of Terminator-esque futures or where everyone just is laying in stasis and just in VR all the time. So yeah, I'd rather that.
Yeah. Fair, very fair.
So what's ahead in the next 6 months or a year for both Retinad and Lumiere?
Well, Maryam, you're a strategic consultant. You want to share your vision? Because I've got my ideas, but you always help me refine them.
No, I'm gonna let you take that.
Oh, really? Wow, it was a hard game, hardball today. Okay, I share the vision of how do you make VR a little bit more ubiquitous, and how do you get it to as many people as possible, and like what is a good use case. And I really believe in Lumiere's vision of virtual reality should be, despite it being argued as a very isolating experience, I think it should be social, and I think it should be an extension of an existing experience. So I really believe in the model of like a museum or a co-working space or any office space right now, that allows you to jump into a VR experience as a complementary to something that you would experience in the real world. So the use case of, let's say, I'm walking through the Louvre in France, and I want to experience what it used to look like, or what this artistic piece, how it was created. And I want to get to know the author or the creator of this piece, and experience what, maybe even France was like 200-300 years ago, what Paris felt like. Being able to step into that world and experience that, the history or even the future, something that you wouldn't be able to experience on the day-to-day basis, I think is a phenomenal use case for VR today. And that's something that Lumiere VR is developing right now by establishing these, what we call the micro theaters that Maryam was explaining before, in these spaces. So I think that on the horizon is super exciting stuff that we're working on. And then volumetric video capture and photogrammetry. So while there's a lot of limitations in the way that we capture video today for virtual reality, understanding the way that it's growing up as a medium, and understanding that VR video is something that, when successful, I think falls something between a linear story and a video game. So essentially, not quite a video game where you have every option possible available to you and you can kind of run around and there's challenges, but not quite linear content where you're just a passive user watching a story with a director and a narrator and a protagonist. Immersing yourself either as a third party character inside of a story is super important, and really, really interesting to this new kind of medium that's being born, or putting you as a first person protagonist potentially inside of a film, and giving you kind of the agency that a video game would give you, but not quite as much, and allowing you the video game or the film to behave in the same way that a video game would. So maybe you can interact with the character, you can interact with, let's say, like different elements in a scene. Like if you open up a door, maybe there's a different story that's told, or if maybe you're a character and you actually brush up against like a glass inside of a virtual world and it drops, and that catches the attention of these AI characters inside of the virtual world, or these computer characters like that. The possibilities and my imagination, or your imagination as a content creator, can kind of go everywhere. So something Lumiere is working on the content creation side with volumetric capture with companies like 8eye or Metastage in Los Angeles, or some really, really cool things we've pioneered.
Well, very cool. So what's the best way for listeners to get in touch and find out more about Retinad and about Lumiere? Yeah.
We're always open we're always happy to chat. We're based in San Francisco Bay Area and in Toronto, Canada, and have an outlet as well in China. So if you're ever in one of those large ecosystems, you can probably catch us there. Easiest way is also through just like digital channels like social media. So, the usual suspects: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Come say hi with Lumiere VR or Retinad VR. Find us in the metaverse. Also, like the Facebook VR channels and Oculus venues. We're always participating on those. So come say hi.
That's great. Well, Alex and Maryam, thanks for coming on the podcast, and very interesting. I really appreciate your thoughts and insights.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate your time.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.